Hi learners, and welcome to a natural sciences lesson. So today we're going to be dealing with expansion and contraction. But did you know the following? That objects expand and become larger due to a change in temperature. So objects, they become larger and they expand due to the change in temperature. So throughout this lesson, we're going to be looking at how and why the objects expand and also why do they contract. So now, in order for us to be able to do that, we are going to now look at things that we need to achieve by the end of the lesson. So things that you should know by the end of the lesson. So looking at our objectives, things that we need to be able to achieve by the end of this lesson. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to, number one, explain the concepts of expansion and contraction. And then number two, use the particle model of matter to explain the concept of expansion and also contraction in solids, liquids, and gases. And then on top of that, you're going to use the very same particle model of matter to now draw the diagrams that are going to be illustrating the expansion and contraction of solids, liquids, and gases. So now, in order to be able to achieve these goals, we are going to break them into small concepts that you're going to be dealing with individually, and then at the end of the day, we look at the holistic picture of the entire lesson. So to start, we're going to be looking at expansion and contraction as the main idea, and within that, we're going to be looking at temperature and the particle model. And then our second concept would be when we look at the expansion and contraction of different materials. However, I do know that there are certain things that you already know about these topics that you're familiar with. So to begin, these are the things that you should already know by now. That all matter is made up of tiny particles that are too small to be seen by even a microscope. Number two, that these particles are always in motion. So the particles that are making up the matter are always in motion. So they can either be vibrating when we are talking about a solid, and then they can also be moving in all directions. That's now when we are referring to liquids and gases. So when they are moving in all directions, they are moving chaotically in a random order. And then number three, that you know that the particles have spaces between them. And those spaces, they differ in terms of which particle are we looking at. Are we looking at the particles in a solid, looking at particles in a liquid, and looking at particles in a gases? The spaces between that matter is different from matter to the other one. So, the question that we have that is going to now want us to go back to what we know and answer this question is, we need to draw diagrams to represent three different states of matter, particularly the spaces between the particles. So we're going to draw three states of matter, and within them, we're going to be specifically looking at the spaces between the particles that are making up that particular matter. So we do know that the three states of matter that we have solids, we have liquids, and we have gases. So what we need to do is to draw particles that are making up solids, particles that are making up liquids, and then lastly the particles that are making up the gases. And then within that, we're going to be particularly focusing on the spaces between the particles. We do know that the particles in a solid have small spaces between them, and then the particles in a liquid, they also have small spaces, but then slightly bigger than the spaces in a solid. And then the spaces between gas particles are much larger as compared to the other two, those being the solids and the liquids. So when we draw, this is going to be our gas particle, our solid particle. They have spaces between them, but then those spaces are very small. Right? And then when looking at the liquid particles, those ones we know that they take the shape of the container, and the solids, they are arranged in a rigid manner. So therefore, if you have our liquid, there must be spaces between the liquid particles. Now, those spaces, they are slightly bigger than the spaces of a solid. Right? And then when looking at the gases, those ones, they don't have any particular arrangement. So they are just moving around within the container that they are in and moving around randomly in all direction. And the spaces between those particles is way bigger as compared to the spaces of a liquid and also the spaces of a solid. Solids are arranged in a rigid way, in a rigid manner, whereas liquid, they take up the space of the shape of the container, and there are spaces between the particles which are slightly bigger than the spaces of a solid. But when looking at gases, they do not have any particular shape, and the spaces between the gas particles are much larger as compared to the spaces in a liquid particle and the spaces in solid particles. So with what we know, we are going to progress with our lesson, and within that, we're going to be looking at certain keywords that are going to be helping us to explain what we are talking about throughout the lesson, which would be the expansion, the contraction, and also the thermal energy. So by definition, expansion, that's now the increase in dimension, where we are looking at the volume of an object or substance when subjected to an increase in temperature. So expansion is an increase in dimension when that object is subjected to an increase in temperature. Then contraction, it's the opposite of the expansion, whereby we are looking at the shrinking in the dimension of an object or the substance when subjected to a decrease in temperature. So for a substance to expand, temperature must increase for that particular substance. Now for it to contract, the temperature needs to decrease, or for it to shrink or contract, the temperature must decrease. Now what do we mean by thermal energy? Now that's the energy contained within a system that is responsible for its temperature. So throughout this lesson, we're going to be making use of these words and some others that are going to be able to help us understand what we are going to be talking about. So before we start, we're just going to quickly take an ad break, and I'll see you just after this.